Hey, and welcome to this course where I'm going to teach you how to build a chat application using React.js and the Chatkit API. I'll teach you this through 17 interactive screencasts, and by interactive, I mean that you, as the viewer, at any given time, can pause the screencast, jump into the code, and change it. You can then see how your changes affects the output. So I'll encourage you to do that whenever you're confused, so that you make sure that you understand the relation between the code and what's being displayed on the page. And I'm also going to give you 5 challenges throughout the course where you'll, for example, be asked to finish up my code in order to reach a certain goal. However, if you don't manage to solve the challenge, don't worry, I'm going to show you the solution as well. So by the end of this course, you'll be comfortable using React.js. You'll understand how to handle data, how to structure projects, event handlers, hooking up with APIs, and a lot more. Secondly, you'll also get to know Chatkit, which is a super nice API for creating chat applications. It's basically an API which gives you the power to build whatever kind of chat app you want without having to set up all the infrastructure and hassle that's involved with real-time chat applications. So by the end of this course, you'll actually have built this chat application here. It's a chat app with multiple rooms, which you can switch through this menu on the left-hand side here. You can also create rooms. And thanks to Chatkit, it's as fast as any other chat application out there. And towards the end of the course, when you've understood how the entire repository works, you're going to get your own copy of this chat room through cloning the repository and save it to your profile. And as a bonus, I want you to have your own personalized chat application. Not necessarily just the same as this one. So we're going to go through how to use CSS Variables and CSS Grid to personalize the application through easily changing the theme of the app, and also to shuffle around on the different components. And both of these things are super simple to do using CSS Variables and CSS Grid. And there are also 2 hot new technologies of modern browsers that needs to be in the tool belt of a front-end developer in 2018. And once you've personalized your chat app, I'm also going to point you to further resources where you can expand upon and build more complex features into the app. Finally, who am I? My name is Per. I'm a front-end developer, online instructor, and also one of the co-founders of Scrimba, which is the interactive coding screencast tool you're looking at right now. But without further ado, let's get started on the first lecture of the course. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to have a look at the component architecture of our app, because in React, everything is based around components. And before you start coding your app, you should break the UI into components. And it's a good idea to actually do it visually, like I've done here, using Paint or Preview or something like that, to just draw colored rectangles around your components. And the way you break your UI into this is by starting at the top. So here, the parent component, the common ancestor for all other components, is the one in red here. That's normally called app or main or something like that. And it basically contains our entire application. And then you ask yourself, which direct children does this component have? And in our case, it makes sense to have 4 direct children. So there's the list of rooms on the left-hand side here. There's the chat area itself. There's the form where you enter chat messages. And there's also the form where you create new rooms. So the app component has 4 direct children. The green, blue, brown, and orange one. And then you want to ask yourself again, which children does these components have? And this is just a form, doesn't really have any children. Same with this one. However, the MessageList component, the blue one, has a list of messages inside of it. And it's totally reasonable to turn them into their own components. So each of the messages is a component itself. And you could actually also make the case that this RoomList component should have children as well, because it has a list of rooms here. And you could even extract this title here in a component. It's basically not written in stone. And the reason I've turned each of the messages into components, though not turned each of these into components, is basically just to show you that it's up to you. And both things work. Though in general, the more complex your app becomes, the more you should split it up. And a good rule of thumb is the principle of single responsibility. You want your component to do one thing and one thing only. So if you have huge components which does a lot of things, you should consider breaking them up into multiple components. So in the next lecture, we'll look at how these components turn into actual code as we'll walk through the repository. So I'll see you there. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to have a look at the Codebase Architecture so that you can build a mental model of how this repository works before we start coding. We have the fully functional app here right now, so don't worry if a lot of this looks scary to you, because at the end of the course, it won't. Let's start like we did when we looked at the components on a conceptual level, which was at the root level, meaning the red rectangle here. The component which is the ancestor of all the other components. And that is the app component. As you can see, it lies in the root directory, app.js, and this is also our biggest component. This is where all the magic happens in these various methods here, which we'll later on go through step by step. For now though, I want to have a look at the render method. Because here you can see that this component renders out 4 other components. And they just happen to be the components which were direct children of the red one. So the green, blue, orange, and brown, which was the RoomList, MessageList, NewRoomForm, and SendMessageForm. The reason we have access to these here is because we have imported them up here. As you can see, they have been imported from a components folder. That is the one you can see right here. If we open it up, we'll see 5 components. Here's the message component, for example. That is the one which is not a direct child of the app component, but a direct child of the MessageList component, the blue one here. So let's have a look at the MessageList. Go down to the render method, and it is indeed returning the message component, meaning that the message component is a child of the MessageList component. So hopefully now you're starting to build an understanding of how this architecture here translates into React code. We can also have a look at the NewRoomForm and the RoomList and the SendMessageForm. And as you might notice, all of these components are much smaller than the app component. And that is a very conscious choice, because we want the app component to be a so-called smart component, meaning it handles all the logic. It takes care of talking with the Chatkit API. As you can see, we've imported the Chatkit SDK up here. And it also takes care of handling all the data. That's done in the state here, which you'll learn a lot about in a few lectures. So this is the brains of our application, whereas the child components, like this message here, is in contrast actually pretty stupid. They only take whatever data they get from their parent and render it out. Some of them also have some event handlers for handling input from the users. For example, the SendMessageForm. This one down here, it of course needs to accept user input. However, it doesn't do any logic with the data. It just takes the data and sends it off. And it of course doesn't take care of talking with the API. Nope. All of that is done in the app component. And this separation is a best practice, as you want as many of your components to be as stupid as possible while gathering the brains at one place higher up in the hierarchy, as it's much harder to maintain an app if the logic is spread across tons of components. So as much as you can, try to have one or few smart components and the rest of the components as stupid as possible. So let's have a look at the other files. Let's start with the index.html, for example. It is ridiculously simple. It has a link to the CSS. It also has a div with an ID of root. More on that in a minute. Plus, it's also linking to the bundle of all of our JavaScript, which is index.pack.js. And this pack here is because Scrimba is using Webpack under the hood, so it needs to refer to index.pack.js instead of index.js, which is the one you can see here. And this is where we're connecting our React app with the index.html file. Because as you can see, we're importing the app.js, which is the root component. We're saying React DOM.render this app in the element with the ID of root. So we're taking our entire application, which exists in app, as that's the common ancestor for all of our components, and shoving it into the DOM, which is exactly here. Then we have the styles in style.css, and we're not going to go through the basic CSS in this course, as I'm assuming that you know basic CSS. However, we're going to look at both CSS Variables and CSS Grid, as that is 2 super cool new modules in the CSS spec, which will allow you to build your own version of this chat app, which is customized exactly how you want it. Now you can say goodbye to all of this beautiful code, and the next time you see it, you'll actually understand it as you will have coded it yourself, or at least together with me. And in the next screencast, we'll actually start doing that. So stay tuned, and I'll see you there. Hey, and welcome to the first lecture where we'll actually jump into the code and start building. So now I'm in the app.js file, and as you can see, the app component is significantly simpler than it used to be. I've removed all the logic, so all that we're left with is the render method, which here returns the 4 children of the app component. That results in a significantly simpler UI. Each of the components are simply rendering out its respective name. Now, we're going to start by building out this MessageList component here, and it can be found down here. So what we want to do, of course, is render out a list of messages down here. So we need to remove this help text and write some JSX. But first, we need data. And we're not going to hook up with the Chatkit API just yet. So I'm going to paste in some dummy data, basically an array which contains 3 objects. And each of the objects contains a sender ID property and a text property. And this is a simplified version of the data we'll get from Chatkit later on. Now, in order to render this stuff out on the page, you have to first escape out of the JSX syntax, because we can't just write JavaScript inside of JSX. We have to use curly brackets in order to embed JavaScript expressions inside of JSX. So inside of here, we can do dummy data.map. We're going to fetch out the object itself, which we're calling message. And we also need the index using a fat arrow function. And for each of the items, we're going to return a div tag. And now we're in JSX land again. So we need to move over to JavaScript land. So we'll do curly brackets again. And let's just start by rendering out message.text. We run this. As you can see, we're rendering out the messages. Brilliant. So now I want to give you your very first challenge. I want you to render out the sender ID in addition to the text. So pause the screencast right now, jump into the code and change it so that it renders out the sender ID as well. And if you don't manage to do it, then just resume back to this screencast and I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so I hope you managed to solve this task. Let's see how it's done. So I'm suspecting that some of you might have been tempted to simply add another div tag here, do message.senderID. And if you try to do that, you see now, if we run the code, we're getting an error. React is basically saying that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag, which means you can't simply render out 2 JSX elements besides each other like this. You have to wrap them in an enclosing tag. And you can actually do it if you use an array. So that's a feature React added in version 16, but we're going to use the enclosing tag. So what we want to do is wrap both of these in another div, like that. You run it. It works. Beautiful. Now, I want to add a couple of classes in order to apply some styling. Let's run it again. Ooh, it looks beautiful. However, we're getting another message in the console. And it's saying that each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. So what we need to do is give this item here a key prop, like this. And this is why I wanted to fetch out the index as well, because we can use the index as the key. If you run this again, it works, and we're not getting the warning. Now, it's actually not recommended to use the index as the key. It's rather recommended to use a unique ID. And using the index is kind of seen as a last resort solution, because the reason we're doing this is so that React properly can identify these dynamically created children from each other. So that if you start adding, removing, replacing, and shuffling around of these items, React knows 100% how to separate the items from each other based upon their ID. But since we're not going to change the order of our items right now, we can use the index for this dummy example. However, in the next screencast, we're actually going to fetch real data from the Chatkit API. and swap this index out with a more stable solution. So we're actually progressing pretty quickly now, so stay tuned for the next lecture, as it'll be packed with interesting learnings. Hey, let's have a look at how I can get started with the Chatkit API. So Chatkit is built by Pusher, which you can find on pusher.com. They have a really nice collection of several APIs, which help you create collaboration and communication features in your apps. The one we're going to use is called Chatkit, and it's probably the easiest way to implement chat in your app. It's in public beta, and it's free while it's in public beta, and they'll always have a generous free plan, so you don't have to worry about suddenly having to pay. Now, in order to get started, you need to sign in or create an account, and then you'll take into the dashboard, where you can see an overview over the instances you have for their various APIs. And if you click this instances here under Chatkit, you'll see your instances. The one we're going to use for this course is called Scrimba Chatkit course. When you head into that one, you'll get to an overview page where you have all the keys, tokens, and stuff like that, which you need in order to connect with Chatkit. And you can also create users and rooms here manually for when you're playing around with it and experimenting. In the next screencast, we're going to connect our app with my Chatkit instance. And I'm also going to challenge you to connect our app to your Chatkit instance, as you should have your own instance and I should have mine. So I'm looking forward to see you there. Hey, in this lecture, we're finally going to connect with the Chatkit API so that we can fetch out the messages from a given room. Now, the first thing we need in order to do that is the Chatkit SDK. And as you can see under dependencies here, I've installed the SDK. I've done that using npm, but I could easily also have simply linked to the source from the HTML because they have CDNs in which you can just point a script tag to and then easily fetch out the SDK that way as well. However, we're going to use npm. And the way we get a hold of the SDK is by doing import chatkit from Chatkit. Then there's the question, how do we hook up a React component with an API? And the way you want to do that is through using a lifecycle method called component did mount. And it's triggered directly after the render method has been invoked. So here, we'll create a chat manager, and we'll use the chatkit.chatManager to create that. And inside of here, we need to specify a few parameters. First, we need our instance locator to tell Chatkit which instance we want to connect with. And that is the one we created here. It's called Scrimba Chatkit course. And here you can see that we're getting an instance locator. Now, I've copied this one to the config.js file. Here it is. And I'm exporting this one along with another one, which we'll look at in a minute. So I'll simply do import. I'll just copy these two from config, like that. Now I can do instance locator, like that. And actually, as the key and the variable which is holding the value, meaning the instance locator string, is called the same, I can actually omit this one here and do like this. And we also need to specify a user ID, because Chatkit needs to know which user we're connecting with this instance. And as you can see down here in the dashboard, I've created a user manually here. So we're going to use that one, user ID for Borgen. And finally, there's the token provider, which we'll create using new Chatkit token provider, like that. And here we need to pass in a URL. And that URL is the one we're getting if we scroll down to test token provider here. You can see your test token provider endpoint. And this is only for testing purposes. What you'd rather have in production here is an endpoint which you have created, for example, using Node. And there you would authenticate the user, which you could do using the Chatkit server SDK. You also might want to do some other stuff, perhaps talk with your own database. And however, for testing purposes, we're just going to use this test token provider here in order to authenticate ourselves. So I've copied it again in the config file and exported it as the token URL. So I'm just going to paste in the token URL like this. And now we have a chat manager properly set up, meaning we can use it to do chat manager.connect. And that'll return a promise. And when that promise is resolved, we get access to the current user. And the current user object contains a bunch of methods for interacting with the API. So the current user is our interface for talking with the Chatkit API. We can start off by doing current user.subscribe to room, like that. In this object, we need to specify, of course, which room we want to subscribe to using the room ID. And as you can see in the interface here, if you scroll a bit up, I've created a room called random here. And I can interact with this room programmatically using this identifier here. So I'll copy that one and paste it in here. Then we need to provide it with at least one hook. So we have a hooks property here. And the most important hook, which basically is an event listener, is called onNewMessage. Because that listens for new messages. And when we're building a chat room, we want to be notified every time a new message has been emitted in the chat room. So here, do message, we're using a fat arrow function. And I'm just going to console log out the message.text. Now, let's run this code. And as you can see in the console, we're logging out 3 messages. Hey, how's it going? Great, how about you? Good to hear. I'm great as well. And that is indeed the messages I've already pre-created in this room. Now, if this room contained tons of messages, we could have considered adding a message limit, for example, 10 messages. That means the Chatkit would only fetch out the 10 latest messages, and you could set that to up to 100. However, by default, it's 20, and I think that's a suitable number, which means we can actually omit this. So I'm going to remove it, but I wanted you to be aware that you can control that. One thing you might be a little bit confused over now is that Chatkit gave us the same data as we had in our dummy data. However, now we are actually indeed fetching it from Chatkit. And in order for you to really internalize this, what I want you to do now is actually to fetch messages from your own instance and your own chat room. And these keys that you obtain here will be the basis for the chat application you'll create later on. So I basically want you to swap out the following values. The room ID, the user ID, also the token URL and instance locator. However, they're located in the config.js file. So I'll add comment here and here. Swap out this one and this one. And the way you do that is by first heading over to pusher.com/chatkit and either scroll down to the sign up area or click the sign up button here. And you can actually click this slide to get to pusher.com/chatkit. Once you've created an account, you're taken to the dashboard, and there you're going to click the create button, and that'll create your very own Chatkit instance, which you'll give a name. And once you've done that, you're taken to the overview over your instance. And the first key you're going to copy is this instance locator. So click the copy icon right here, and then head to config.js and swap it out right here. Then you want to scroll a bit down to the test token provider. And here you need to check this box in order to enable the test token provider endpoint. And you won't actually see it at all until you've checked this box. So do that. And then hit the copy icon, go back to the code and swap it out here. Then scroll a bit up again, enter a username here, hit create, and then head over to app.js, paste in your username here. Once you've created a user, you'll be able to create a room, give it a name, and hit create. And then this little alert box will pop up with the room identifier, which you'll copy and paste in right here. And then finally, I want you to enter a message into this field here and hit send, because that'll send a message manually to your chat room. And it's important to understand that you won't be able to do this on my instance, because only I have access to my instance dashboard. And if you are to create a chat application, you need your own instance. You can't continue using my instance locator, as it's through the instance you create rooms. And I reckon you want your own rooms in your chat app by the end of this and not share rooms with mine. So go ahead and do all this now. And when you run this code, you should see the message you have entered in here appear in the console. And then note down these keys which you are fetching, as you're going to use them later on as the basis of your very own chat app. So good luck with this, and I'll see you in the next screencast. Hey there. Now we've managed to fetch data from the Chatkit API and log it out. So that's good. However, what we want to do is actually take this data, the messages, store it in our component, and then pass it down to the message list, which is the component that's going to render this data out. So we need to do something else than simply logging it out. And specifically, we need to add state to this app component. And state is one of two main ways of handling data in React. The other one is called props, and you'll be introduced to that in a minute. And throughout these introductions, you might feel a bit confused at times in terms of what the difference is between state and props. I at least was in the beginning. And I found that the only way to really internalize this is to just see a lot of examples and write code yourself. So I think as we move along, it'll be clearer and clearer for you when it's suitable to use state and when it's suitable to use props. But in short, state is private for a component. So our state, which we're going to create now, will only be state for the app component here. And it's also possible to change the state from the component itself. However, props is not private. It's shared between components, and the components who have props can't change them directly themselves. It has to go through some kind of state change higher up in the hierarchy. Now, this probably sounds very theoretical, so let's actually just get started so that you'll see it in action. The first thing we need to create is a constructor method. The constructor is the very first method that is called in the lifecycle of React components. And it's actually a special method of ES6 classes, and it allows you to interact with the this keyword, which points to the instance of this class. However, before we interact with this, we have to call super. And what super does is call the constructor function of the class, which this class has been extended upon. So that is the React.Component class. So when we're calling super, we're calling the constructor function in the React.Component class. And that sets stuff up for us so that we can start interacting with the state. So we'll do this.state and set that as an object. What we're going to do here is we're going to store the messages in the state, and we'll initialize it as an empty array. What we now can do is for every new message we get from Chatkit, we'll do this.setState. And inside of this object, we're describing how we want our new state to look like. So we want the messages to change. And what we want to do is actually add this latest message to the end of the this.state.messages array. So we'll use ES6 and do this.state.messages, and then add the latest message at the end of this new array. And you might be a little confused what these three dots here are. That's called the spread operator. And that allows you to expand this.state.messages array to rather fit into the array we're creating here. So you can look at it as if we're taking the this.state.messages, which is encapsulated in two square brackets like here. So if we didn't have these three dots, it would be like this. They would just take up one item in this new array. But now with the three dots, we're rather expanding it so that they forget about their old square brackets and just fit into this new array instead. So this array is expanded to fill the brackets of this array definition rather than its old definition. And this here basically creates a whole new array which contains no reference to the previous objects here, as this is a new copy of this.state.messages with the latest message concatenated at the end. And you might now ask, so why didn't we just do like this? This.state.messages.push message. And that's because this push method would actually modify the original array. So we'd modify the state using .push. You should never do that. The only way you should modify the state is through this.setState, meaning that we need to copy this.state.messages and expand it into our new array while adding the latest message at the end. So now that we have messages in our state and it's being updated as new messages comes along, let's try and render out this.state.messages We run the code, and there we can see that this.state.messages is being filled up with objects as they're added to the state in this onNewMessage hook. Let's remove this one here and this one here. Now what we want to do is pass this data down to MessageList. And we're going to do that through props. And the way you give a component props is through giving it what looks like an HTML attribute. Let's do messages equals. Then we have to escape out of the JSX again, because there we're going to add a JavaScript array. And it's, of course, this.state.messages. Now we can head over to the message list and let's try to swap the dummy data out with this.props.messages and run this code. And as you can see, we're getting the exact same data that we had. And this does not come from the dummy data. Actually, we can remove this one. We can render it again. And we're now fetching real data from the Chatkit API and displaying it in our app. The way it happens, just to go through that quickly, is whenever Chatkit registers a new message in this chat room, this event handler is triggered. We're doing this.setState, taking the previous this.state.messages and concatenating it with the latest message so that this array here is updated. And then when we render the MessageList component, we pass along the messages by giving it a prop called messages, giving it the value of this.state.messages. And the way React works is that every time this data here changes, it'll trigger a re-render and the data will be passed down to the message list. And that'll trigger a re-render of message list. And here we're simply mapping through that data, this.props.messages. Remember, now it's props, it's not state, because the state is private and can only live up in the app component. And when you pass it down to components like this, it is turned into props. So we did this.props.messages, map through it, and just render it out as we did with the dummy data. So we're moving along really fast here. We already have an app which talks to the Chatkit API. That's pretty cool. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to turn this here into its own component, namely the message component. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to finish up the message component here. Because as you remember, when we broke down our UI into components, we wanted each of the messages to be their own component as well. And here I have the setup for that component. However, it just contains an empty div. So what we need to do is move some of the content from here and into the message.js file. Or actually, let's start by importing the message component into the message list file. Like that. Now actually render it out through doing message like that. So we're going to replace this here with this component here and then fix up this component so that it renders out the stuff we want. So the first thing we need is to move this key here over to the message. And we also need to pass down some data. We basically want the sender ID and the text. And now I'm actually going to call the sender ID here for username, because I think it makes more sense to call it a username. Message.sender ID. Because a message component in itself should take a username prop and a text prop. And it shouldn't care that here in the underlying data that's powering the message, that it's called a sender ID. I think semantically, it makes sense to call it a username. Whereas the text prop can easily be called text, which is what it's also called in the data. So this is the new stuff. This is the old stuff. Let's now copy these two divs here and delete the whole thing. And then go into message.js. Like that. However, now we're referring to message here and .senderID. That's wrong. Here we need to refer to this.props.username and this.props.text. So let's run the code. And as you can see, it still works. So now we've actually passed data down 2 steps. Starting from the app component where the data lived as state, passed it down to the MessageList component as a messages prop. In the message list, we got access to the messages through this.props.messages. We looped through it. And then we passed some of that data, namely the sender ID and the text, down to the message component as two different props, username and text. So in the message component, we're doing this .props.username and this .props.text. Now, this is a really nice little component. It's very stupid. The only thing it knows is that it's supposed to render out a username and some text, and it doesn't do anything else, which is great according to the principle of single responsibility. So what I want you to do now actually is to turn this into a so-called functional component. Because when a component doesn't have state or any lifecycle methods or any other methods, you can actually make it even simpler than a class. You can turn it into a function. And given that functional components have so many constraints, they're less prone to bugs, and a lot of people prefer them over class components. So go ahead and check out the documentation right here, this link, where functional components are described, and try to change this to a functional component. And once you've done it or given up, resume back to the screencast, then I'll show you how to do this well. So go ahead and do that right now. Okay, hopefully you managed the task. Let's now see how we can turn this into a functional component. I'm going to remove the class keyword, and we're not going to extend upon the React.component class. We're just going to do good old function syntax. And this is a function. It can't have a render method, so we're going to remove the render method as well. And basically just return the JSX directly. And the final thing we just need is the props, which is the argument of the function. That means that we can't refer to this .props.username. We have to do props.username and props.text. There's actually no this inside of this function. This is undefined. So let's run this. And boom, it works. So now you're really starting to get a lot of tools in your React.js tool belt. And in the next lecture, you're going to learn about event handlers. So stay tuned and I'll see you there. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to build out this SendMessageForm component. That is the one which you can see down here. So that's where you can write your messages. As you can see, we have the basic setup here already. It's just a form with a class name and an input field, which has a placeholder, and it's of type text, of course. Let's change this placeholder to something like, enter, like that. It's a bit more descriptive. Okay, so the thing with form elements is that they kind of keep their own internal state based upon the user input. Because when I type something in here, the element needs to keep track of what I've typed in. However, as you know from learning about state in React, we usually want to keep the internal state in, well, this .state. And if we rather control the content of an element like this in the component's state, we get a single source of truth, and our application becomes less prone to bugs. So let's take whatever the user inputs into this input field and shove it into the state of the SendMessageForm component. What we'll then do is that we'll use the onChange event handler. This one basically says that whenever this input field changes, whenever the value of it changes, fire off whatever function we specify inside of these curly brackets. So let's do this handle change in here. So this one is listening for changes in the input field, and it's invoking this method whenever a change is fired. However, handle change hasn't been defined yet, so we'll need to define it. We'll do it like this. Here we get access to the event, and let's just log out e.target.value like that. Run the code. As you can see, it's now logging out whatever we type into the input field. So now we only need to take this value here and add it to the component state. And as you hopefully remember, we need to create a constructor method in order to initialize the state. Like that, and we need to call super. Then we can do this.state equals an object, and it'll have one key called message, like that, and we'll initialize it as an empty string to begin with. Now, let's see if we can update the state in this handle change method. Do this.setState message, and we'll set that to the e.target.value. We run the code, try to input something. We're getting an error. Cannot set property set state of undefined. And that is because the this keyword is undefined inside of this method. it's not bound to the component instance, which it is up here in the constructor. And that ties back to how JavaScript itself works. And the way to solve this is through in the constructor, do this dot handle change equals this dot handle change, and then bind the this, which we do have access to in the constructor, to the this dot handle change method. So now if we run the code, try to input stuff, hello, we're not getting an error. We can actually, instead of console logging out that one here, let's rather do this dot state dot message down here, run the code, and write that, and we can see that we now in the render method have access to the state. So what we'll do now might seem a bit weird, but we'll actually set the value of the input field to this dot state dot message. Now, what this does is that we are controlling the value in the input field programmatically so that it can only be whatever we have in the state at any given time. So if we run it, now it works well. However, what's happening here is that when the onChange event listener is triggered, we invoke the handle change method. It updates the state, and then React triggers a re-render in which the value which is passed in to the input field here has been changed, and thus it's updated in the UI. So it's going through the state before your keystroke turns into a change in the user interface, like that. So now we have what's called a controlled component. We're controlling how it works. We don't have any duplicate state in where the input field keeps track of its state and the component keeps track of its state. And we don't have to hope for the two states to match. We know that they will always match. So the next thing we need to do is hook an onSubmit event listener onto the form so that when they hit enter, we'll take the message and send it off. Or we'll at least in this lecture prepare the sending off. And then in the next lecture, we'll see how we can send it off to Chatkit. The way we'll do this is very similar to what we did previously. We'll do onSubmit, as that's the event listener for forms. And we'll do this dot handle submit, then handle submit, create that one here. Here we first want to do prevent default, and then we want to send off message somehow. And we of course need to bind this method to this as well, like that, so that we in this handle submit event handler get access to this dot state dot message, as that's the message we're going to send off. So let's remove this one, run the code. Hello, submit, and there we logged it out from this place right here. Now, finally, I want to point out that the onSubmit and onChange are event listeners provided by React, and they are wrappers on top of the native event listeners, which you write without the capital C and S. However, this .handle change and this .handle submit could have been called whatever we want. Could have done, for example, handle form, run the code. Oops, then I also have to fix this one. Like that, run the code, and submit, and it works. So these names are created by me, whereas onSubmit and onChange needs to be called exactly that. Let's go back to handle submit. I like to have the event listeners and event handlers resemble each other, though only with swapping out on with handle, as I think that's a good practice, which makes the code readable and understandable. So in the next lecture, we're going to learn how to take our messages, send them off to the Chatkit servers so that the message is broadcasted to everybody who is a part of this chat room. So I'm looking forward to see you there. Hey, let's now learn how we can take our messages and send them off to Chatkit. We have set up the send message form so that we're ready to do that down here, but we got to change the app.js a little bit as well. Because as you might remember, the interaction with the Chatkit API happens through this current user object. And that's the one which we got access to in the component mount method, as we got access to it after we had connected with the chat manager. However, it's only available inside of this scope right here. And that's not good. We want it to be available to the entire component instance, because we're going to do current user.sendMessage in order to send messages. So in order to do that, we have to do a couple of things. First, we got to do this dot current user equals to current user. So we're taking the current user and simply hooking it onto the component itself. And by doing that, we can, for example, create a new method, send message. We'll simply do this dot current user dot send message, like that. That's of course only possible since we did this here. And actually, for the sake of consistency, let's also do this dot current user dot subscribe to room here. However, you probably know what we need to do in order to enable the send message method to have access to the this keyword. We of course have to bind it. So now we have access to this inside of send message. That enables us to get the current user object and call the send message method. And inside of that, we're going to specify two things. That is the text we want to send, like this. And we'll get that as an argument of the send message function. And we're also going to specify the room ID. And for now, I'm just going to hard code that in. And as you probably remember, ES6 allows us to omit this one here when the key and the variable that holds the value are identical. So you can do it like this. And now comes a concept which I struggled understanding, and I know that a lot of people find it hard to wrap their heads around. Because as you've experienced here, when we've sent the messages down as a prop to MessageList, data flows in one direction in React, from parent, that's the app.js, to child, which are these here. However, now we're in a position where we somehow need to get the data from down in the message form, that being the data we're storing in the state here, and we need to send that up to the app.js component, because that's the one that'll send this data off to Chatkit. So this is called the inverse data flow in React. And there's a couple of ways of looking at this conceptually. Either that we're sending a method down, or that we're reaching up from child to parent in order to trigger a method. So what we'll do is we'll take this send message and send it down message as a prop. This dot send message, like that. Now the send message form will get access to this method, which again has access to this dot current user dot send message. In the send message form down here, we'll do this dot props dot send message, passing in this dot state dot message. Because remember, we're storing the message in the state. So you can either look at it as if we're down here in the send message form, or kind of reaching our hand up to this method here, or you can look at it on a conceptual level that app.js is passing down this method so that SendMessageForm can borrow it. But either way, the data kind of flows the wrong way from child to parent. So that's why they call it inverse data flow. Okay, let's try it out. Are you watching the game tonight? Enter. Oops, room ID was of type. Oops, spelling mistake. I've written rood ID. Room ID. Let's try it again. Run the code again. And hit enter. Boom! That worked. We now sent the message off to Chatkit via this.currentUser.sendMessage. And then, since we are listening for new messages here and setting the state, adding the latest message to the state here, that state got updated, which again triggered a re-render, so that this message list also got re-rendered, and it results in 4 messages being displayed in the chat instead of just the 3. A final thing I want to do in the send message form is that once we've sent it, we want to clean up the input field. So we'll do this dot set state message and turn that into an empty string again. Now, if we run it, I hope so. Like that, the input field is automatically blanked out after the message has been sent. So we're starting to get a really cool chat application here. The next step now is to start creating the room list and also enable you to create new rooms. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to fetch out all the rooms in our Chatkit instance and then display them in this RoomList component here, which you can see the skeleton for right here. So, as you know, all communication with the API happens in the app component, our only smart component, and it happens through the this.currentUser object. So what we'll do is this.currentUser.getJoinableRooms, like that. That returns a promise, and when that promise has been resolved, we get access to the joinable rooms, like that. What we then want to do is add these joinable rooms to the state. We'll do this.setState joinable rooms, like that. However, joinable rooms aren't the only rooms in this Chatkit instance. They are just the rooms that we haven't joined yet, that this user here hasn't joined yet. Though in our instance, there might be other rooms as well, namely rooms that this user has joined. And they are available in this.currentUser.rooms. So let's add them to the state as well. We'll call it joined rooms. And we'll find them in this.currentUser.rooms. And now that we're setting these in state, we also have to initialize them. Joinable rooms. Joined rooms. Like that. Now I also want to add a couple of catch statements here. That. And down here, error on connecting. We now have multiple promises in this method, and if any of them fail, we want to get a hint of what's going on. And this componented mount is starting to get pretty massive, so we're going to refactor it a little bit later on. If you find it to be a bit confusing, a bit too massive, don't worry, we'll clean it up afterwards. For now though, let's see if we're able to send these rooms down to the RoomList component. So what we'll do is we'll give the RoomList component a prop called rooms. In it, we'll use the spread operator to combine the two arrays of this.state.joinableRooms with this.state.joinedRooms, like that. And now in the room list, we can log out this.props.rooms. Run the code and see that we're indeed logging out, after a few renders, an array filled with objects, which probably is our rooms. So now we need to render the rooms right here. And to do that, we're going to do the exact same thing we did with the messages. We'll do this.props.rooms.map. We get access to the room in the callback function, where we're going to return list item, which is wrapping around an anchor tag, which goes to nowhere, but which contains room.name. And as we're using list items here, we need to add an unordered list, just wrapping these. And I also want to have an H3 which says your rooms. We also need to give this list item a key. As you know, we use room.id. And for styling purposes, we'll give it a class name of room, like that. So let's try to run the code. Beautiful. We're now rendering out a list of all of the rooms we have in our Chatkit instance. This is both the ones I have joined and the ones I can join, and it looks really nice actually. So in the next lecture, we'll look at how to join a specific room, display the messages from that room, and also send messages to that room so that you can jump in between rooms and chat as much as you'd like. So we're actually starting to approach a fully functional chat app. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to learn how to subscribe to specific rooms so that we can click on them and start chatting in them. And to do that, we need to work a little bit with all the code we've added to component did mount. Because now we're just automatically subscribing to this specific room when the component mounts. That's why we get these messages here by default. But what we want to do is that when you enter into the app, you shouldn't automatically subscribe to a room. You should make a conscious choice of clicking on the room you want to subscribe to. So the first thing we need to do is remove this subscribe to room method, this piece of code here, and create a subscribe to room method. Paste that in there. Now let's just call this from here to see that it works. And of course, as always, we need to remember to bind this like that, like that. Let's run the code. As you can see, we're automatically subscribing to that room. So our method works. Now what I also want to do is pull out this one here and turn that into its own method as well. Call it getRooms. And then also replace this code with this.getRooms, that, and of course, bind it. So now we have a much more manageable componented mount method. And what we want to do is enable the user to click a room and thus subscribe to it. So we need to pass down the subscribe to room method down to the room list. So we'll do subscribe to room equals this dot subscribe to room. Now let's make this a bit more readable like that. And inside the room list, when you click on this anchor tag here, on click, this dot props dot subscribe to room, and then pass in the room dot ID. So here we're using an anonymous function to wrap this function call here, because if we were to do like this here would be called immediately when this component renders. So we only want to call it on the click event. So on the click event, this anonymous function gets invoked, which again invokes this one. And we actually don't need those two curly brackets there. So let's also, it's readable. I like to add them to multiple lines if I have more than one attribute or prop on these JSX elements. And we can do it like that. Now, this.props.subscribe to room will call subscribe to room up here. Then we also need to pass in the room ID as we pass that along and just replace this one with the room ID. And now we should be able to subscribe to rooms through clicking on these items here, meaning we'll actually remove this first subscribe to room from the componented mount. So we now want to enable the user to do that instead of doing it automatically. So we'll run the code and click on NFL. And as you can see, we got messages from that chat room. Beautiful. Now, if we head into welcome as well, we'll see that we have a bug. So the welcome messages was placed after the NFL messages. And that's not good. That's because when we subscribe to a room and we get our on new message event listener, we're simply just continuing to append new messages to the state. So what we need to do before we subscribe to a room is clean up the state. Set the messages to an empty array again. Now if we run it into NFL, oops, this.state.messages is not a function. Of course, I have to do this.setState. Like that. Well, welcome. Yes, now it works. What we now need to do is to make sure that we keep the joinable rooms and joined rooms properly updated. Because the list you can see here contains both the rooms you have joined and the rooms you can join. And they look, for this app, completely similar, regardless of whether or not you have joined it. And the thing is, when you subscribe to a room, that means when you're listening for messages and displaying them here, you're automatically joining it as well. So if there's a room that I haven't joined yet, let's say, for example, this NBA room, and I join that, then these two joinable rooms and joined rooms should change. One room from the joinable rooms should be extracted and put into the joined rooms array. So after I've subscribed to a room, we actually need to call this getJoinableRooms again and update the state in case one of the rooms are due to switch array. So here, this subscribe to room returns a promise. So then we get access to the room. And there we'll simply do this dot get rooms like that. So also add a catch here. Like that. And now we should be keeping track of the rooms correctly. What we then need to do is to make sure that we can send messages to the correct room. Because right now, when we're triggering the send message, we're just hard coding in that we're sending a message to this specific room. And that, of course, doesn't work. And the answer to that is also to be found in this callback function here. Because what we then can do is we can do this.setState, and we can keep track of which room we're currently at by doing room ID and setting it to the room.id. Now we need to add this to the state when we're initializing it as well. Room ID, let's just initialize it as null. And when we send the message, just this.state.roomID. So let's try this. Now, I haven't joined any rooms yet because we haven't called subscribe to room. If I click NFL, for example, reference error. Error isn't defined. Let's see. I had 3 R's here. Rerun it again. I click NFL. Error is not defined. Yet again. Oops, I did a weird mistake here. I didn't wrap this in a console log. Now, let's try it. NFL, and I'm getting the messages. Yes. And yes, I'm able to chat in that room as well. Let's try the Premier League one. Totally. It works. Brilliant. So now I can jump around to any room I want and chat with the people in the room. Championship, random, NBA, general. So this is really cool. However, there are 2 more things we need to fix in order to make our RoomList component complete. Namely, making sure that these rooms are always displayed in the order we want them to be displayed in, and that we're highlighting which room you're currently at. So in the next screencast, we'll fix both of those things. Hey, in this lecture, I'm going to fix a couple of things in our RoomList component. And the first one being that if I now paste in a new username here, which hasn't joined any rooms yet, however, it has been created on this instance in the Chatkit web interface, so it is a part of this instance, though it hasn't joined any rooms. What will happen is that when I run the code and I try to join any rooms, you can see that the rooms seem to shuffle around. That's not a good user experience. And it's because rooms jump from being joinable rooms to being joined rooms. And namely happens in this .set state here, when we have fetched out the joinable rooms after the user has joined the room. And this .currentUser.rooms is, by the way, updated automatically. But the point being that an object has jumped from here to here, and thus the order of this .props.rooms down in RoomList, which we are mapping through here, has changed. So the order in the user interface will change. And the way to solve this is to create an ordered array up here. Called ordered rooms equals this.props.rooms. And we'll use a spread operator since we're now going to sort this array. And we're going to pass it a compare function, which takes 2 arguments. And here we're allowed to tell this algorithm how we want it to sort our new array. We're going to sort it by ID. The way it works is that if this returns a negative number, then A will be seen as less than B according to our sort function. Or if we return a positive number, then A will be seen upon as greater than B, and it'll sort it accordingly. So now it should sort our rooms in ascending order based upon their IDs. And we need to create a new array, as sort would indeed modify the original array, and you should never modify props. So then we'll take the ordered rooms and swap this out here. We'll run the code. Now let's try joining. Seems to be working. Really good. They don't jump around. Cool. So now you only have one more thing left, and that is to highlight which room you're currently at. Because right now we don't really know which room we're at. Let's click welcome. And what we want to happen is for this item here to glow up a little or to change color. The way we do that is we're going to give this list item a class of active if this item which is rendered also is the same as the room ID, meaning that it's the one we're chatting in at that point of time. So what we'll do is we need to pass down room ID from this.state.room ID. And then we'll go back to RoomList, and here const active. And if this.props.room ID equals to room.id, then we're going to return active. Otherwise, we'll return an empty string. And what we'll now do here, just very easily concatenate those two strings together. So if it's looping through the current active room, then it'll give an active class to this list item here. Let's run the code. We hit the welcome room, and boom, it's now white, as we have styled it in the CSS so that the list item should be white if it has the class of active. So that was it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Hey, in this lecture, I'm going to show you a trick for automatically scrolling down to the bottom when new messages appear. Like, for example, this. My name is Per. Hitting enter. Nothing apparently happened. However, if I scroll down, ooh, there was the message. And I've sent it as Jane Smith. So rather, my name is Jane. Send it again. Didn't seem to appear, but it actually has appeared. So we need to automatically jump down. Let's go in here, actually, and move this back to Per Borgen. That's me. And the way we solve this is through adding the component did update method. Now, this is yet another of the lifecycle methods in React, and it's called directly after a component has been updated. So this is a nice time for scrolling down if we want to do that. And first, we need to grab hold of the MessageList component itself, the DOM node basically. So we'll do const node, and we'll use method of the React DOM library, DOM, and we need to import that. React DOM from React DOM, like that. We'll do find DOM node and pass in this. And what we're then going to do is set the node.scrollTop equal to node.scrollHeight. So the scroll top is how far we've scrolled down, and the scroll height is how long our entire scrollable element is. So when we're setting the scroll top to equal the scroll height, we're actually scrolling as far down as possible as we can. And the scroll height is actually measured from the top, so it can't actually be as far from the top as the entire height. But that doesn't matter. This will basically scroll the window all the way to the bottom. So let's run the code, join a room. Now we are scrolled to the bottom. If we try to write, my name is Per, we're scrolled down. However, there are certain situations where we don't want this action to trigger. For example, let's say I'm reading through all the messages up here, and then suddenly a new message appears at the bottom. Now, what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to head into another window, which you can't see here at Scrimba, and then I'm going to write a message from that client. So I've connected from that client as well. So just sit tight. I'm going to write another message and send it, and boom, suddenly this was sent from another client, another browser basically, which I couldn't show you via Scrimba. But it was a little bit annoying that when I was reading messages up here, suddenly I got pulled down to the bottom. So what we want to do is check if I'm also somewhere near the bottom, and in such case, we'll jump down. But if I'm far up here, we'll just keep appending messages down below, and I'll actually have to scroll down to see them. And perfect place for doing this is component will update. And that is triggered right before the component has been updated. And here we can check where I am in the scroll position. So first, we need to grab hold of the node here as well. And we'll do this dot should scroll to bottom. And if our node scroll top, that's how far we have scrolled down. And our node dot client height, that's the height of our window here. So now if we scroll down 20 pixels or something, now our scroll top is 20. And our client height is this entire window, and it's maybe 330 50 pixels. So let's say that this in total is 370 pixels. And if that is greater than or equal to the node.scroll height, is the entire element, meaning that we are actually at the bottom, since how far we have scrolled down plus the height of this window here equals the entire box, or more than or equal. That's just in case we by some reason manage to scroll further down. Then we should scroll to bottom. So we'll do here if this.scroll to bottom, then we're going to do this. Now let's run the code. Now we're in the welcome room. Hey, boom, we're scrolled down. But if we now scroll a bit up and we write, yo, it actually worked. We did an auto scroll. And finally, I want to give a little buffer. So in case we're down here, we're almost at the bottom, we still want it to jump down. So we'll do that by adding plus 100 here. And now, if we're almost at the bottom, it works as well. Really nice. So now we're starting to get a chat application which actually has a good user experience. So then the final feature is to make this new room form work. And after we've done that, we're done with all the JavaScript. And I'm going to show you how to modify this chat room so that you can create your very own chat room, both in terms of layout and theme, so that you basically can start chatting with your friends with your homemade chat application. So it seems I'll be holding my promise I gave you in the beginning that you will end up with your very own custom personal chat application at the end of this course. So I'm looking forward to see you in the next screencast. I'll see you there. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to build out the NewRoomForm component, which basically allows you to type in the name for a room, and then it'll pop up here, and you can start chatting in that room. And people who are part of this Chatkit instance can also join that room and chat with you. And they can, of course, also create rooms. So this will be very similar to how we did the SendMessageForm. So I'm going to go quickly through how we'll build out the NewRoomForm. As you remember, we prefer to create controlled components. So we're going to give this one an on change handler, and I'm going to trigger this .handle change, which is a method we'll write here. In it, we'll do this .set state and set the room name to e.target.value. Now, we cannot work with state without doing super in the constructor, like that. Super, and we'll also initialize the state to room name to equal an empty string. Next up, we need an onSubmit event listener on the form. We'll do this .handle submit. And there, we'll simply first prevent default. And then we'll tell the app component that we want to create a new room. And the way to do that, as you remember, is to pass down a method from the app component down to the child component. So we'll do create room like that. Not write any code here yet. Let's just pass this down to create room so that we have the architecture. And also we need to remember to bind this, that, and that. Now in this new room form, we'll do this .props.create room, passing in the name, which we have in this .state .room name. So now let's, in the app component, room name, do a logging of the room name, just to see if we can make it work. I think, oops, cannot read properly set state of undefined. What have I done? It has to be down in the new room form. This dot, of course, I forgot to bind this in our two event handlers. That's how it is to code sometimes. It's a lot of things to remember. And we'll copy this and I'll submit like that. We'll run it again. And my new room like that, hit enter. And boom, room name, my new room. So we are able to connect the two components and pass down the method for creating new rooms. So now the final thing to do is to just create the new room. We'll do that through, yet again, use this .current user, and it has a method called create room. In it, we'll pass in the name of the room name. What we actually can do now, we can rather call this for name and omit this one here, and it returns a promise. And when that promise resolves, we get access to the room. And what we're going to do here is subscribe to that room, because I think that's a good user experience. When you create a room, we instantly jump into it. And luckily, as we have extracted the subscribe to room functionality in a method of itself, we'll just do this .subscribe to room, passing in the room.id. And let's also add a catch here. If we get an error, we're going to console log out error with create room. Log out the error. Now, let's run the code. And let's say that I'm a huge fan of the World Cup. Let's do like that. And there we have a whole new room called World Cup. Who'll win? I'll ask. And I can chat in that room. And now I'm actually going to go to another tab. You won't be able to see that, but I'll log in as another user in this chat room, and then I'll send a message. Brazil is what I sent, and that popped up here immediately. So this chat works. However, finally, we need to empty this input field once we've submitted it. And we know, of course, how to do that. It's super simple. This dot set state room name like that. All right. Champions League. Enter. And it didn't get. Ooh. So I noticed that I, in my rush, had made a mistake, because I've actually forgotten to set the value here explicitly. Meaning that I haven't done like this .state.room name. This wasn't a fully controlled component, as we only sent the state from this input field to the component state. We didn't go full circle and set the value based upon the state as well. So that was an error on my side. And it can serve you as an example of when you're trying to do something quickly, when you think you know easily how it's done because you've done it before, because I had done it in the SendMessageForm before, then I was in such a hurry that I forgot this. And there's a lot of things to remember when you're coding, and it's not a good idea to think that you have everything under control. You got to pay attention to the details and double check so that you can find those small little things you've forgotten to do, which opens up the app for bugs. So let's try it out. We'll write golf, for example, submit it, and boom, as you can see, there it is, while the new room form has been cleared out. Now, finally, I want to change this to create a room, like that. So now we're almost finished with all the JavaScript of this course. I just think there's one last thing we should do, and that is, before you have joined the room, it should say join a room here, and if we try to input something and try to send a message to the Chatkit API, we'll get an error because we haven't defined which room we're sending that message to. So to fix this, we'll first head over to the message list. And here in the render method, we want to check if we actually have chosen a room. So then we need to pass down the room ID like this. And if this.props.room ID, here I'm checking if this.props.room ID is a falsy value, so not a truthy value, then render this stuff out here, or return this stuff here, return. And this is just the div wrapper, and I've created another div, which has a left arrow and the text join a room in it. And then we'll just close this off. So that. Let's try and run it. Nice. You get this join room. When you join room, it disappears. And then in order to disable the input field before we have joined the room, I'm going to have to head down to SendMessageForm, and the way we disable an input field is by giving it an attribute called disabled. And if it's true, it'll be disabled. So what we'll send down here from app is actually a prop called disabled, and we'll give it the opposite value of this.state.room ID. Because if the room ID is null, then this will evaluate to true, meaning this disabled will be true, and this.props.disabled will be true. So let's try this. Now, test join a room, and I can't enter anything into this input field. If I join championship, for example, I can. Brilliant. So that was actually the last piece of JavaScript we needed to add to our app. In the next lecture, we're going to start modifying the chat room using CSS Variables and CSS Grid so that you can create your very own personalized chat application, which is just the way you like it. Hey, as we now have built out all the features of our chat app, it's time for you to get your own copy of the code. So that in the next couple of screencasts, when I'll show you how to customize the layout of the app, you'll be able to do that on your very own copy and not using my code. And I'm going to explain you this through using slides. So the first thing you want to do is click the settings icon here at the top of the left sidebar. That'll open up this menu, and click on the clone workspace. That'll open up a modal. I want you to select a playground and then give it a title and hit the confirm button. And then you'll be taken to your very own Scrimbot playground. And you might have to sign in if you haven't done already, as this will be saved to your profile. You'll see your avatar here in the top right corner. And you can also find this playground from your own profile. And then the next step is to connect this playground to your own Chatkit instance. And if you followed along in screencast number 6, where you obtained your own instance locator key, test token provider, and username, you can just paste those in to the project right now. However, if you didn't do that, I'm going to revisit how to do exactly that. So first, head over to Chatkit. You can click this slide to get to the page, sign up, and then you're taken to the Chatkit dashboard. Here, you want to click the Create button, which then opens up this modal, where you'll give your instance a name. Hit the Create button, and then you're taken to the overview over your Chatkit instance. And when you create an app, you always want your own instance. You don't want to share instances with anybody else, as it's in the instances that you create rooms, and you want full control over your own rooms. So copy this instance locator here. You can click the copy icon, and then paste it into the second line in the config.js. So swap it out here. And then you scroll a bit down, you see test token provider. There, you must check this enabled box in order to see your test token provider endpoint. So this box will be unchecked and you need to check it. And then click this icon to copy your test token provider endpoint and then paste it in right here. When you've done that, scroll a bit up to the instance inspector and then create your own user. Hit create, and also create a room and hit the create button. You'll see this room input field once you create a user, as you need to create a user first in order to create a room. And then paste your username right in here. And with those few easy steps, you have the setup you need in order to customize your very own chat app via CSS Grid and CSS Variables throughout the next 2 lectures. So I'll see you there. Hey, in this lecture, I'm going to teach you about CSS Grid and how we're using CSS Grid to lay out the different components and how you very easily can swap around on these and turn this chat application into exactly the type of application you want layout-wise. So here is our code for creating the grid. We first do display grid. We're setting the height to 100%. And we're then defining some columns and some rows, and then template areas. Before we jump into exactly what these mean, let's see what it does actually. Because what then happens is that CSS splits the entire div, which is the app div here, which wraps our entire application, it splits it into columns and rows and basically turns it into a grid. And as you can see, we have 6 columns and 6 rows. And the reason we have that is because here we've said in grid template columns that we want to repeat 6 times 1 fraction unit. And fraction unit basically means that we want each of the columns to be equally wide. I'm explaining fraction units more in detail in my CSS Grid course here on Scrimba, which you also can check out. But for now, just look at this as it's giving each of the columns 1 unit each. Unless, though, one of the columns require more space, which this one here does, because the content of it forces it to be wider than 1/6 of the width. So then it captures a little bit more space, and the remaining columns take up 1 fraction unit each, and now there's only 5 fraction units left, so they take up 1/5 of the remaining space. And I'm doing almost the same with rows, though here I'm not using the repeat function, where I'm saying 6 times 1 fraction unit. I'm doing it manually. I'm saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fraction units, and then the last row should be 60 pixels tall. So why is that? Well, that's because I want this input row here to be 60 pixels tall regardless of the height of the chat app itself. Because if it was only 1/6 of the width, then when I did like this, it wouldn't be enough room to enter text. It would be tiny, so I want to have a fixed height. So we've defined that we want 6 columns and 6 rows. Then we end up with this huge grid here. And what we then can do is use grid template areas. What we're doing here is we're creating 6 strings, each representing a row, and each character, separated by a space, in these strings represent a cell. So when you see them like this, these cells here represent a column. So this is basically a visual representation of this grid here. And now comes the interesting part. The characters here are representations of the components, because we have given, for example, the NewRoomForm component a grid area property of n, meaning that it will fill up the n area in this visual representation, meaning it'll take the spot down in the lower left corner. And indeed, that is where our NewRoomForm is located. And of course, this NewRoomForm, if we head into NewRoomForm.js, it is the class name we have given it. And RoomList is the R, and we have said that we want it to occupy everything above the NewRoomForm, which, as you can see in the example, is exactly what this is doing. And here is the MessageList component, and here is the form component itself. I just call that an F. I probably should call that an S, since that starts an S to be consistent. But anyway, we can actually change that right now and rather do S like that. So now, here's the brilliant thing. Let's say that I want the SendMessageForm component to take up this space here as well. Then I'll just paste it in, and boom, as you could see, now the SendMessageForm became much taller. Doesn't look very well though, so I'll revert it. What is cool is, for example, let's say we perhaps want this entire column here to be on the right-hand side instead. I'm going to take this here. I'm going to cut it out and move over here and paste it in. And now suddenly we have a UI which, works. And perhaps I want to have the NewRoomForm top instead of at the bottom. Then I'll just do like this instead. Now I can create rooms up here, and here's my rooms, and here's the chatting area. So as you can see, it's really easy to basically play around and create the layout you want. So now I want you, in your fork, which you've already created from the instructions of the previous cast, create your own layout, which is not like this one, or try to experiment with the layout and find one you like. Just shuffle around on the items until you're pleased with your layout. And then in the next lecture, we're going to change the theme as well, meaning the colors of the application. So I'll see you there. Hey, in this lecture, we're going to have a look at CSS Variables, which I'm using to set the colors for the chat room. And if you haven't seen CSS Variables before, they work like this. So first, you need to define the scope of your variables. Here, we're selecting the root tag, which selects the root element. And in our case, that is the HTML element itself. So that means that these apply for our entire application. The syntax for them is -- variable name and then variable value. Now what you then can do is use this main color inside of the root element in the DOM. So let's scroll a bit down, and here you can see that I'm using, for the rooms list, the main color as the background color. And the syntax is var, then the parentheses, and then the variable's name. And you have to use the var, and you have to use 2 dashes. And as you can see in the app, I'm using this color not only as the background here in the room list, but also on the background on the messages themselves. So what's so cool is that I now can change this to, for example, red, and boom, it changed in both places. And just have a look at my variable names here. We have main color, main text color, secondary text color, SendMessageForm. So this is actually super powerful because now you can change the entire theme for the app just by changing these values here, as most of these are used multiple places throughout the app. So what I'm going to do now actually is paste in another color palette I found online. Like that. Now I'm just overriding this one. I should probably be explicit about that and take it completely away. But now my app is really, really nice and pink. That's just through adding these 5 variables, and since they are used all over the place, here and here and here and here, it completely changes the feeling of the app. So what I want you to do now is go online and find a color palette you like, try and swap out these here so that you get a chat app which really matches you as a person. However, don't do it in this. I think you should do it in the fork, where you've also perhaps changed around on the layout a little bit. What you then will end up with is something truly unique. For example, let's say that you also have done this. And what you have here is a chat app which is really different than the one we've been coding on throughout this course. At least it looks really different, even though the underlying architecture is similar. But go ahead and do that, and I'll see you in the final lecture of this course, where I'm going to talk about how you can even further expand upon your chat app. So you have finished the course. So give yourself a pat on the back, because most people who start online courses never finish them. So this is a really good job of you. You've taken time to invest in your skills in a way that most certainly is going to pay off. And now you can jump on to other challenges, or if you want to, you can also further expand upon your chat app. And here I have a couple of closing challenges or stretch goals, or call them whatever you want. It's voluntarily something you should do if you want to continue diving into how to create awesome chat applications. Because what would really enhance the user experience of this app is if you added an online users component, meaning displaying which users are online in a room at any given time, and also typing indicators to see if someone else are typing in that room. And I'm going to point you towards how to solve these, though not give you the entire solution. For the online users, you'll find the information you need in the this.currentUser. So let's log out this.currentUser.rooms. Let's pick a room, for example, the one at index 3. And then do user IDs. We run this. As you can see, that logged out a long list of usernames. James Black, James White, Jane Doe, Jane Red. As you can understand, I'm not that creative in coming up with new names. However, you could take this and display it, for example, creating a component above the chat room here. Or maybe you want to merge it together with this stuff here and somehow show user avatars below the room. If you want to do that, there's a really nice service called UI Avatars, which allows you to generate avatars from initials. And then there's the typing indicators, and you can check out the docs on Room subscription hooks. Just click this image and you'll be navigated to it in another tab. And the ones that are relevant here are the on-user started typing and on-user stop typing. And they are to be added as hooks here. So you'll do on-user started typing, then you'll get access to the user. And here you can render out users. And as you know, you should probably create a new component for this. But I'll stop giving hints here, because now it's your turn. So if you want to, try to solve these challenges. And no matter what you do, I wish you good luck with your further coding. Thank you.